I feel like sometimes night owls are portrayed as villains to productivity. You oftentimes see endless videos and articles that talk about the fact that being an early bird or waking up super early at 5 a.m. at the crack of dawn is something that you absolutely have to do. While I do agree with a lot of those points, the lack of representation for night owls is jarring. Seems like there's no representation for night owls, so in this video, it's time to shed light on the potential benefits of burning the midnight oil versus being an early bird. The first thing that's super important is that it helps a maker's schedule. So this was something that was famously quoted by Paul Graham. There are basically two types of schedules, which we can call the manager's schedule and the maker's schedule. The manager's schedule is for the bosses. It's basically a traditional appointment book with each day cut up into 1 hour or half an hour intervals. You can certainly block off several hours if you need to do a task, but oftentimes by default, it's basically changing every single hour depending who you are meeting. When you use time this way, it's merely a practical problem to how you will meet somebody. You find an open slot in your schedule, you find a place to meet them, you book that, and you're absolutely done. Most powerful people are on a manager schedule. It's essentially the schedule of command. But there is another common way of using our time that's very common among people who are writers, artists, painters, programmers. And that's called the maker schedule. So for a lot of students who are doing homework assignments, and for those of you who are working full-time, those of you who have been on a maker schedule know it's an absolute disaster to schedule meetings in between that. Essentially, when you're operating on a maker schedule, meetings are an absolute disaster. A single meeting can blow off an entire afternoon because it breaks your schedule into two pieces that's much too small to accomplish the task that you're trying to do. Plus, you have to remember to go to that meeting. I can't tell you how many times that it was hard for me to start an assignment at school or do something at work just because I had a meeting directly in the next 2 or 3 hours. Having different meetings is no problem for somebody who is on a manager schedule because they're adapted to context switching. But when someone is on a maker schedule, they really have to think about it. So this leads to my first benefit of being a night owl. If you're a night owl and you're on a maker schedule, you can have as much uninterrupted time as you want. This is in contrast to being an early bird. And my example for this is, say that you wake up at 5 a.m. You have to hard stop at 9 a.m. because that's when you have to go to work or when most students have to go to their classes. Now, the reason why people recommend you to wake up super early is because you get this uninterrupted time to get started on your day. However, that time frame is always set and it's always fixed. Now, sometimes you might wake up at 5 a.m. and you don't actually need the full 3 or 4 hours before your day starts to finish the work that you need to do. Or you need more time, but you can never decide this when you're early bird and you have a set morning schedule. I can't tell you the number of times when I was at school and I made the commitment to wake at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. and then I realized that in the morning, I actually don't really need something to do that takes and requires this much time commitment. And then I'm just left there in the morning watching soccer highlights and not actually getting enough sleep. So the issue with the morning schedule is that it can be extremely rigid. Now, contrast this to a night schedule, and you realize you can actually extend it for as long as you want or make it as short as you want it to be. If you're done your work early, you can get an early night's rest. If you feel like you need to keep going, you can make that decision right then and there to extend it as much as you want it to go. You can then work till the early hours of the morning, however long you want to have uninterrupted time. I do acknowledge that there is a key problem to all of this. So I was actually inspired to make this video because I was watching Demis Hassabis's podcast with Lex Fridman talking about his schedule. So Demis Hassabis is the founder of Google DeepMind. He's going to be a super important figure as this AI revolution goes on. And he talks about the fact that most of his important work is done during the night. But he does acknowledge a key problem in doing this, which is at around 12 or 1 a.m., he makes the decision whether he wants to continue on reading his research papers, doing whichever creative work that he's doing at nighttime. But he's going to have to pay that debt the next morning. Essentially, if you stay up till the wee hours of the morning at around 4 or 5 a.m., you know you're going to suffer that next morning. You're accumulating debt for that next day because in the next day, you're going to be a bit groggy and not going to be at your optimal level. While I do agree that this is an issue, I like that flexibility as a night owl to make that decision at 12 a.m. So at 12 a.m., I can decide, do I want to pay that debt the next day? If I realize the next day I'm just like hanging out, socializing in the morning, then I can make that sacrifice and suffer and not be in that optimum level. But I really like that flexibility as a night owl. That's something that as an early bird, you don't really have. I'm going to let you in on a bit of a secret of mine, which is I actually don't think that the concept of night owl or early bird actually exists. So I'm a neuroscience student, and for those of you who don't know, every human is on a circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythms are the physical, mental, and behavioral changes an organism experiences over a 24-hour cycle. Light and dark have the biggest influences on circadian rhythm, but food intake, stress, physical activity, social environment, and temperature also affects them. But there's something super important by the circadian rhythm. We generally have a peak when we first wake up in the morning after 1 or 2 hours. After lunch is when we typically have our quote-unquote afternoon dip, and this is highly related to our circadian rhythm. And then in the evening after dinner is when we have our next peak. What I actually believe is that we are all early bird people and night owls due to this circadian rhythm. So this is the conundrum that I kind of ran into. How do I optimize for both my morning time as well as my nighttime? I came to a conclusion that I really have an important 2-part day. So the morning hours to me, the first 2-3 hours are incredibly important, and I try to value that as much as possible. I try not to let it get interrupted by any phone calls, by any social activities, by anything that will disrupt me from doing important work. When I get to the afternoon, this is where I deal with my dip. So at this point is where I let myself do some more social activities, where I let my brain wander a bit more, and where I schedule some of my less important tasks during that day. I essentially take this time to rest up until my evening peak, and this is where I get started working right after dinner around 7-8 p.m., and I'm able to work uninterrupted until about 12 a.m. And it's at 12 a.m. where I make the decision, do I want to sacrifice my morning hours the next day? Or am I accepting the fact that this work is super important to me and I need to do it right then and now? A lot of times I decide not to sacrifice my morning because I realize that the morning 2 or 3 hours is really important to me. But on occasion, I have that ability as a night owl to decide, but this task I'm doing is super important, especially with creative tasks. It's super important and I can't let it get interrupted because if I let it get interrupted, it will disrupt my flow the next morning. So I also have this app that I used. It was actually free for a period of time. It's called Peaks. And essentially it tells you when your morning peak starts during the day as well as when your evening peak starts. And it really depends on when you wake up as well as when you go to bed. So really, it allows me to be more flexible with my schedule because it tells me, okay, this is when you wake up, this is when your peak is going to be, this is when you're going to drop, and this is when your evening peak is going to start. Do what works for you, figure out your circadian rhythm, your peaks, and optimize for both your nighttime and your morning time.